The, the recording has been started now, and I would like to thank participants who have arrived here today, and more than anything, thank Richard Knowles for being willing to do this seminar, which is being broadcast to anyone who happens to have the link. And we have about a couple of dozen people registered, not all of whom have signed on at this point. So a little bit of logistics first. When you have a question, you can put it into either the chat or the Q&A box. The Q&A box is probably appropriately, I'm going to monitor that more, but I'll look at the chat box too, rather than putting up your hand, because putting up the hand is a very invisible little signal for me. So I think, Richard, you want to have questions along the way, or would you like to make your presentation first and then field questions?
Let's do it along the way with a proviso. If I think that it might be appropriate to hold it, I'll mention that. Would that be all right?
Okay. So can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Yeah, good. Everybody else will be too. So let us now, Carrie Cowan's saying that she's only seeing me. Is anybody else having trouble seeing Richard? So everybody sees both, so except Carrie. I don't know what your situation is. Carrie, try going into the speaker view and then the gallery view. That might help. So Richard, could you please introduce yourself? And I will remove myself from the screen. And when there is a question, I will pop on, and that will enable you to tell that there is about to be a question, and let us know whether you are ready to answer that. And if you are ready, then I'll bring that person on.
Should I click onto the slides now?
Introduce yourself first, unless you want to introduce yourself with the slides.
That's fine. I have some information on the slide, but I'd like to start off by recognizing that this is Veterans Day, and I'd like to thank all the veterans who may be on the line for all the work they've done over the years to help our country. So thank you for that. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's on the call and on the webinar. Today I want to talk about leadership. And I have a lot of experience about that. I've studied it, tried to understand what's going on. I've read many books. And most of the time, I didn't get much help from them and felt terribly inadequate that I was not measuring up to these ideals that were being spoken about. And so I began a quest of my own. And this talk today with you is about doing leadership. Leadership is very difficult. It's hard. And doing leadership is what I want to talk about. Not talking about it, but doing it and helping you understand how we can do it together and be quite effective. And it began with myself trying to become more authentic with myself, with simple guidance of doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. It's 3 simple rules for guidance. And I also began a quest to try to find out, why do people do what they do? What are the scientific basis for what's going on? And I'll share some of that with you as well. So I'll begin with my slides now. And I want to talk about a self-organizing criticality change process. I've been at this work for a long time. I was in research for 14 years. I was a plant manager for 22 years. I've been doing this work in consulting for 23 years. I've written some, I do some teaching, and I'm a student. It's been a long journey with a lot of work, but what we found works. So the purpose of the work is to introduce this idea of self-organizing criticality change process using complexity science and John Bennett's systematics, a combination of those. Share some simple and useful tools so that people can solve complex problems and co-create their shared sustainable future. So the agenda today is some story, talk about the complexity tools, talk about the nature of change, the nature of problems, the importance of purposeful dialogue, the process enneagram and transformation, and then how to hold the system together and sustain it at the edge of chaos, far from equilibrium.
By the way, are you showing your slides already?
Yes?
We're not seeing them. You haven't shared them appropriately.
Okay, what do I do?
You need to go to the share screen button at the bottom of your panel, and then choose what the slides you're going to share, and then share those. So there's 2 shares.
Sorry about that, folks.
They're coming.
Okay.
Yes. Now, but you could also make them a larger, right? Yes, that's good.
We're okay now? Sorry
Yes.
about that. Okay. So I talked about the purpose of the work and the agenda to talk about these complexity tools, the nature of change, the nature of problems, and the importance of purposeful dialogue and the tool of the process enneagram, and then how to hold the systems together, because we've got to be able to hold them together or they will blow apart, fall apart. So a lot of what I learned when I was the manager for this large chemical plant in Bell, West Virginia. Plant's about a mile long, about a third of a mile wide. We're in the Kanawha Valley. That's the Kanawha River that you see on the right-hand side, which is the 2nd oldest river in the world after the Nile. The Appalachian Plateau has not been disturbed for over 600 million years. So this is very old geological formations. At this plant, we handled many very highly hazardous materials, the 2nd highest number in the DuPont company. Some of it in large quantities. We'd had hydrogen cyanide in tank cars. The big white storage tank you see at the bottom of the picture was 110 feet high and 100 feet in diameter and could hold about 40 million pounds of anhydrous ammonia. So we were doing a lot of work with very highly hazardous materials and were able to be doing it quite well. I was transferred into that plant from being a plant manager in Niagara Falls, New York. The plant in West Virginia was started in 1927. They made all kinds of chemicals using high pressure technology, including intermediates for nylon for the Second World War. When I got there, the safety performance was terrible. They were having about 75 serious injuries a year. The organization was extremely dysfunctional. The mechanics were fighting with the operators fighting with the mechanics, the supervisors fighting with everybody, the engineers always squabbling. And management staff was totally disconnected from what was going on. And coming in as an outsider, people had a very low trust level for me. West Virginia has been abused terribly by big companies like the coal companies, and so outsiders have a hard time gaining the trust and respect of the people. We had about 1,300 people at the plant. Early on, as I was trying to reestablish the standards, things got pretty rough. And people tended to try to avoid being around me. And I discovered I could make people disappear. I could walk into a building and nobody's there. Walk out of the building and look back and there are people all over. So I go back in the building, nobody's there. And this went on for a couple of years before we were able to begin to open up the communications and have really meaningful discussions. We were making good progress. And then one day we had a fire in the unit where we were making Vaso 52. Vaso 52 is a polymerization initiator. And it's a 10-hour half-life in benzene at 52 degrees. In polymerization reactions, the nitrogens in the middle break out and you have two free radicals which initiate polymerizations. The material is very reactive. It's quite flammable, but it's a nice white crystalline solid. So as we made it, we'd have crystals in the reactor, then we would filter them and extrude the filter cake through a screen and make noodles about the size of my little finger. The noodles would drop onto a slowly moving conveyor belt, and they would move through a hot air dryer to evaporate the water. Well, because standards weren't very good and people were being kind of sloppy, residue was building up in the corners of the dryer. And one day they caught fire. This stuff is really flammable. Our fire brigade responded. They did an amazingly good job, and they got the fire out quickly, but the building was a mess. Soot all over the place, wires hanging down from the ceiling that had been burned and broken, instrument cables broken. And we only had about 3 weeks of inventory. So people pitched in and they began to do an extraordinarily good job to get ourselves restored. And it was an amazing thing to watch. And about 6 months after the fire, I was out walking around the plant and I was in the control room of this operation. And the mechanics and operators were talking quite nostalgically about how great it was in the fire and how people worked together really well. And Joe wasn't the usual idiot that he was, and Bill wasn't always playing games. And finally I said, fellas, we can't burn the place down every 6 months to feel good. You know, we got to figure out a better way to do this. And that set me off on this long journey, looking at two questions. Why do people get so badly behaving in organizations and become so dysfunctional? And then why does this same group become a high-performance work team instantaneously in a crisis? And so what was happening in the crisis? We had cooperation, open flow of information, decisions being made at all levels. Everybody pitched in. There was a lot of excitement and energy. And there are lots of good ideas and creativity. I began thinking about this some more and more deeply, and the characteristics revealed by the fire were that the situation is compelling and obvious. The darn place is on fire. And we got to do something, and we got to get it out quickly. So these things are quite clear. There's not a lot of ambiguity about that. Everybody had a stake in the successful outcome. People knew they needed to work interdependently and help each other. People knew they have to do their best to get together, and people did their best. However, while we're working at this high level of performance, we can't sustain it for very long because the energy level is too high. So what happened here? We had all this dysfunctional behavior in the organization. They transformed quickly, but after the crisis, they went back and doing the bad stuff again, and the fighting and all the dysfunctional stuff. And the question, why can't we work together all the time like we did in the crisis? Not at the energy level, which you can't sustain, but we can do all the other stuff. And what we've discovered over the years is that we can work that way. I want to talk about how to do that. During the course of this journey, I used a number of different tools and we blended them in many different ways. Direct experience and observation was one. As I mentioned, I walked the plant 5 hours a day. I did a lot of listening and paying attention. We used John Bennett's systematics with the monad and the dyad, etc. We used theory from chaos and complexity. And some of you on the seminar may have helped me to learn some of this. I'm not sure who all of you are. And recently, in the last couple of years, I've been learning a lot about per box self-organizing criticality. And that's become a way in which to bring all these different ideas together. And then we use the Process Enneagram, which I'll talk about more. Looking at what happened during the fire from the complexity perspective, people self-organize instantly. People know how to do it. We don't make people self-organize, they do it. They put down all their non-purposeful behavior. The managers do their stuff, the operators and mechanics do their stuff. They work interdependently and help each other. There's a high intensity. They worked faster, we covered the operation, they felt really good, but then they went back to the old way. So let me talk a little bit about the nature of change that we've learned in the course of this work. We're going to look at it from a complexity perspective. Change during a crisis and change during more, quote, normal times, if there are anything really normal. And it's about self-organizing criticality and the nature of focused, disciplined, purposeful dialogue. And as we bring people into the conversations and more people get involved, we get a huge amount of variety of input and thinking, and the resilience of the organization increases. And we live in a complex world. People and events are constantly interacting. People are self-organizing. And all of you have experienced this. Whenever you go to a reception, you see people self-organized. They're talking in groups. They form, they reform, they move around. Nobody tells them what to do. They're just self-organizing. People are constantly adapting. As we pick up clues from the environment around us, we continue to decide which ones to react to and how to move. But coming out of a complexity theory, we cannot predict the future. We can predict general patterns, but we can't predict details. Events do not proceed in a linear fashion. It's not just simple A, B, C, D. It's maybe A, B, A, C, D, whatever. And nobody knows everything, yet everyone has important information. It's like we're on a beach ball and I'm on the green stripe and you're on the red stripe. On the green stripe, I can see certain things you can't see. On the red stripe, you see certain things I can't see. So doggone it, we ought to talk together about this so we know more about what's happening. So from a complexity point of view, people are self-organizing. It's all the time. A few simple rules generate lots of complexity. For a leadership guidance, sharing information, doing it in a way where you build respect and interdependence and trust, and help people see how they fit in. Those three simple rules are fundamental to leading. We pay attention to patterns because patterns are the clues to the invisible things that are going on. The idea of fractals is very important because when we see patterns in one place, we're likely to see similar patterns in another place. If people are fighting on the loading dock, they're probably fighting in the front office. In complexity, we have many agents interacting all the time. It's dynamical, it doesn't sit still. And we have this idea of self-organizing criticality, which can move us out to the edge of chaos or far from equilibrium. Now, Purbach introduced this idea of self-organizing criticality in 1988. It's the spontaneous emergence of complexity from simple local interactions. And he was looking at this as a fundamental property of nature, looking at sand piles, earthquakes, forest fires, traffic jams, wars, all kinds of natural phenomena follow the rules of self-organizing criticality. And these systems all follow power laws. If you think about an earthquake and the tectonic plates are touching each other and the pressure builds and they're self-organized and then they slip, that's an earthquake. Most of the time, the earthquakes are quite small. Sometimes they're intermediate in size and sometimes they're huge. And when they plot the intensity of the event versus the frequency on log-log plots, you get a straight line, which is called a power curve. All of these systems have these power curves or factors for them. So let's look at the sand pile with its hourglass. The sand is falling from the upper container slowly onto the bottom, and the pile on the bottom is self-organizing and building up potential energy. At some point, the next grain of sand causes a slip in the pile. And just like the earthquakes, most of the slips are little. Some are intermediate in size, less frequent, and rarely you get one that's so big the whole pile collapses. Organizations experience self-organizing criticality. The people are self-organizing by developing a shared identity, building relationships of trust and interdependence, and abundantly sharing information. These are simple rules that will lead to enormous complexity. Through myriads of focused, disciplined conversation, the energy builds, one conversation at a time, like the grains of sand. At some point, the energy grows and the organization begins to shift its behavior and begin to change towards what they want. Think of each conversation in the organization as if it's like the grain of sand falling on top of that pile. The energy builds. Things begin to move. Things begin to shift. And the organization becomes leaderful. That is, anybody who sees that something needs to be done initiates the process to get the thing fixed. They may not do it themselves, but they get people together and talk about it, and things begin to move. They don't wait around to be told what to do. We use a tool called the Process Enneagram, which is a dissipative process that helps the people to move into the self-organizing and criticality energy curve. And then we create a map with this, and that will help us to stay high on the curve and hold ourselves there. Now, organizations are complex, adapting, self-organizing networks of people. There's not like the little blocks on an organization chart. Those just tell you where to send the United Way checks or the fund requests. Organizations are open, dissipative, and metastable systems. Open in the sense that energy and information flows in and out of them. The healthier the organization, the more these flows occur. And we can use the Process Enneagram, which is a dissipative process tool, to create an attractor, a dissipative structure. So the conversations are the energy. The Process Enneagram is the way to hold the dissipative process and create the dissipative structure. So let's take a look at the energy curves in self-organizing criticality. And the first one here is looking at a crisis. The potential energy in the organization goes up, it gets positive, or it's negative, and the downward arrow shows that. So at the start of this process is an event, a decision needing to be made. The leader has a choice. And most of the time, in most of our organizations, we want to maintain stability, reliability, predictability, and control, which is fine for an airplane and machines, but it's not, because people are not machines. But we have these, in many organizations, a strong top-down approach to running the organization. They impose their will. They already have the answer. They want to maintain the status quo. And unfortunately, this kind of managing organizations creates cultures of fear and anxiety and struggle and cynicism, some mix of these kinds of characteristics. And surveys in our country show that about 80% of the people in organizations are unhappy because they're living in this kind of an environment, and you're seeing this kind of stuff. But there's a choice. In a crisis, there's so much happening that the managers can't control it all. And the natural tendency to self-organize comes into play. Conversations open up related to the challenge. So in the fire, we had everybody talking about things. People were deciding what to do, making decisions about how to get back into operation. The managers contributed some, but most of the people were contributing much, much more. As people talk together, new ideas come out. New ideas emerge, things they hadn't thought about before. New ways of seeing happen. And we move out towards the edge of chaos. When you're at the edge of chaos, things can fall apart. But they don't have to. And usually organizations overcome their crisis, and they develop a temporary culture like the one I saw with the fire that we had. There's a sense of urgency, there's clarity, there's hope. Those kinds of things become part of the culture. So the culture changes from the one at the bottom of fear and anxiety to one of sense of urgency. But in a crisis, when it passes, they are not able to hold themselves out at the edge of chaos. They don't know how to do it, neither the managers nor the other employees. And so they revert back to the old way. Now, if we take a look at this same kind of a pattern in normal times, the lower branch is the same as one we talked about. That's where most organizations reside. But if the leadership is open to the conversations relating to the challenge and bringing more people in, talking more widely about what's going on, focusing at the things they really need to be doing, you can get purposeful engagement. That enables really good decision making to take place. And again, we have this emergence. And we move out to the edge of chaos. And again, things can fall apart. But we don't want that to happen. We use the Process Enneagram as a tool to help people talk together, and we can co-create our future. And we have this culture of a sense of urgency and those other characteristics. And we get a lot better business performance and a lot better organization where it's safe for people to be themselves. And we don't have bullying and harassment. So you can have all of that. So if we take a look at what's going on here, we have that upper branch I call partner-centered leadership. The lower branch is more like the management stuff that we do. Making sure the supply chains work, bringing in the raw materials, allocating people to different tasks. But if we just stay in the management curve, we tend to wind up sucking the energy out of the organization. With partner-centered leadership, the energy and creativity build. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in self-organizing criticality, most of the changes are small, a fewer middle-sized, a fewer big. But over time, these changes continue to accumulate. And early on, you have to pay attention. For example, when I was working with the mayor of Niagara Falls, New York, and her leadership team, I knew we were beginning to make progress, and one of the groups said, we have a pickup truck that we're not going to be using for the next couple of weeks. Does anybody need another truck? That's a big step because organizations normally do not share stuff like that. Another offers some secretarial help at a time when their workload was down a little bit. Those were little tiny clues, these small changes to pay attention to the big changes. And over time, the city was able to change, and these changes accumulated to the point where they took $16 million out of a $62 million budget. Some of it was buying insurance more carefully. Some of it was the street people and the sewer people talking together and deciding to fix the sewers before they pave the street, rather than pave the street and then tear it up and then pave it again. These conversations that we have are collected together on the Process Enneagram, and we create what we call a map, and I'll show some of that. And the map then becomes the living strategic plan for the organization. Rates of change differ. In a crisis, the rate of change is very rapid, but it's not sustainable and it collapses. When we're engaged in purposeful change, it begins more slowly, but builds up over time. And that's what we want to do, is engaging in the purposeful change. And we can move from the status quo to excellence. And we can hold it at the level of excellence. So we want to build this dissipative structure and hold the organization near the edge of chaos. So we need to understand the nature of problems, recognize organizations are dissipative systems. We use the Process Enneagram Map. We engage the whole organization. That is, everybody throughout the organization can be engaged in the conversations because, as I mentioned earlier, we all have information to share. We share information. We do it in a way to build trust and interdependence and respectful. We help everybody to see the importance of their particular roles in the success of the whole. And we use disciplined, focused, continuous, open dialogue. Now let me talk a little bit about the nature of the problems we're dealing with. And some of this comes out of the work of David Snowden. One class of problems are simple problems, like me getting dressed in the morning, which is not very complicated. Complicated problems are like a production line, or running a payroll, or running a supply chain. They can be very, very complicated. But in a production line, if all the parts come in at their time they're supposed to, and they are the right quality and put together right, you get a product. It's a linear, stepwise process. It can be quite complicated. The problems that are really the hard ones for us all to deal with, however, are the complex problems where we have a dynamical interaction of many components, and they're not linear. The way to look at the problems is some of this work of Ralph Stacey, using a little chart like this, where the vertical axis is the level of agreement, high being the bottom, low at the top. And the horizontal axis is the level of certainty, high at the left and low at the right. So when we're in high levels of agreement and high levels of certainty, we're dealing with simple problems. We know what to do and we know what the outcome will be. That's also true for the linear multi-step ones, although they are a little more difficult. But many times we don't have a good agreement about what to do, or a very high level of certainty about what's going to happen. Now we're dealing with complex problems. And this is the area where partner-centered leadership becomes so important. And the tool we use is the Process Enneagram. Now, living at the edge of chaos, far from equilibrium, the systems in constant, disciplined, focused dialogue about the important problems. We use the Process Enneagram. Everyone has a voice in creating it. All the information is visible to everybody. And there are co-created and enforced principles and standards of behavior that provide the space for the safety for the people to open up and become more creative. If our environment is one where we don't have bullies, if it's one where we can tell the truth, if it's one where we can help each other, we open up the space for people to become much more creative and innovative about what's going on. So what I want to do is to show why this Process Enneagram, a dissipative process, is useful and needed, and how we can create the attractor to hold the organization and sustain the work. Process Enneagram is a unique complexity tool. Dr. Yap Kane Cheng in Malaysia used it in her thesis to study why a particular head teacher had been so effective in bringing up a very poor school to a school of excellence. It's to be used by groups working together with a commitment to create positive outcomes for changes they face. And Beverly McCarter and Brian White, in their book, Leadership in Chaotic Organizations, said that it appears to be the bridge between complexity theory and practical application. And my whole journey in all this was to try to develop a way for people, regular people, to understand what's going on and to help make a difference. So the challenge we're facing, organizations are complex, adapting, self-organizing networks. Levels of uncertainty and ambiguity are growing. We need to use these new complexity tools. Focus, discipline, dialogue are so important. That provides the energy that drives it all. Now let me talk about the Enneagram a little bit. It was introduced by George Gurdjieff into Petersburg, Russia, St. Petersburg, about 1915. He had study groups working on it, and one of the students was a fellow named Uspensky, who in 1949 wrote the first book about it, called In Search of the Miraculous. Bennett picked up on this work and he created systematics, and he further developed the idea of the Enneagram. And Anthony Blake, one of Bennett's students, carried this further, and he wrote a book called The Intelligent Enneagram in 1996, developing more information. But when I was introduced to this in DuPont by a consultant, all we had was that figure shown at the top. 9 points, arrows inside. Hard to make sense. Why was that important? What was going on? And we struggled and struggled. And one time, several of us were traveling, and we were in the U.S. Air Club in Charlotte, North Carolina, late at night. We came up with the idea of taking Bennett's systematics and applying them around the Process Enneagram and create a Process Enneagram. And I took Bennett's systematics ideas and I put names on them that we could begin to relate to. So in 1996, we created this. We recognized that the systematics of Bennett provided the models and language for us to talk about complexity and chaos. We developed a practical use as a complexity tool. Identified the significance of the points and the lines. Described the patterns for leadership and activities. Revealed the patterns for sustainability. Revealed the whole, the parts, and the interaction of the parts. Revealed the who, what, why, and how things are going on. Opened up 3 leadership processes and 2 transformational processes. Revealed 3-dimensional dynamical nature of the process Enneagram. And then we've introduced this to hundreds of people around the world, including just last week out in Salt Lake City, working with a company to help them become more effective. So we took this esoteric, rather secret tool and made it into a tool which all of us can use. And as we use it, these things become available to all of us. This is the tool that helps people to solve complex problems, make the social connections they need to make, that is the people they need to talk with, and in course of doing this, their emotional energy and commitment gets released. So if you look at the Process Enneagram figure, point 1 was we put the monad. You think of a monad as take a blank sheet of paper and draw a circle. What's in the circle, what's outside the circle, and what's the edge? That's the conversation about the monad. What is it you're doing? We call that intention. We begin at 0 saying, who are we? At 2, we look at the problems of why we can't get to where we want to get, and that's called the dyad from Bennett. At 3, we talk about our relationships together. At 4, we talk about the principles and standards of behavior, and this is the triad. The work is the tetrad, etc. There's a whole bunch of theory on this if anybody wants to get into it. But let me show you some diagrams here about how it works to try to illustrate this. So I want to begin talking about an ineffective McDonald's restaurant. Most of us have been in a McDonald's at some time or other. We're going to look at that from identity, intention, issues and ambiguities, relationships, principles and standards of behavior, the work, the information sharing, how we learn and create potential, and how we're structured. So in the ineffective McDonald's, we know they're McDonald's because of the golden arches, and we know that they do fast food. We know their intention is to sell hamburgers and fast food and also to make a profit, and usually they're quite profitable. A poorly run McDonald's has problems with bad smells, dirty restrooms, rude clerks, overflowing trash bins. And relationships are ones that give us a feeling of a lot of tension in the group, the clerks standing around waiting to be told what to do, sharp comments among the clerks, low levels of trust. You pick that up as you come into the restaurant. And you conclude their principles and standards are to do as little as possible, wait till you're being told, ignore the public as much as you can, and don't clean up the restrooms. The work that they do, the physical work they do to make the money is to prepare and sell fast food, wait on the customers, and empty the trash and clean the restrooms. That's what they're supposed to be doing. In ineffective McDonald's, information sharing is done through menus and displays and touch screens, buddy training, standardized forms, but it's not very effective and it's kind of hit or miss. So their learning is buddy training. The manager gives the orders. They try to figure out how to deal with complaints. The outside world, the context in which they're working is one where people want quality, a fair price, and cleanliness. And they have a competitive market with McDonald's having Kentucky Fried Chicken across the street and Chick-fil-A down the road. And inside of ineffective McDonald's, you have this top-down management system, and when things get busy, chaos explodes because people are standing around waiting. Now, suppose that we came in and we decided we're going to have ourselves a very effective McDonald's. And so we can, again, look at that from these 9 perspectives. Now, for an effective McDonald's, the identity is the same as for the ineffective one. Golden arches, and they do fast food. They have the same intention, to sell hamburgers, make a profit. Their issues and ambiguities are around how do we stay competitive with Wendy's and Burger King's, and how do we maintain high quality. The relationships are team focused, they're customer focused, they're friendly, there's trust and interdependence. Their principles and standards are around fast food must be consistent, quality, customer focused, clean restrooms, be a team, listen, help each other. The work they do is the same as the ineffective one, but they do it a whole lot better, making fast food and waiting on customers. The information they have is available is similar to what they had in the other, but they use it much more effectively. They have team meetings, they do team training, they do some buddy training as well, but it's much more of a team-focused activity. The outside world's the same as for the poor one. The structure inside is team-based, team leaders, and a supportive manager. So if I came into the ineffective McDonald's, how could I move it to become one like this effective McDonald's? And we begin the process by helping everybody understand that we're in a fast food business, and our intention is to sell hamburgers and fast food and make a profit and have this be the best place it can be. In order to do that, we're going to talk together and we're going to develop principles and standards of how we're going to work together, including these kinds of things. Fair, consistent food service, customer focus, restrooms being clean. We all agree that that's how we're going to work, and we're going to hold each other accountable to do that. Then we'll deal with the issues and the problems we have. And we'll begin to be staying more focused on competition and maintaining higher quality. As we do that, we're going to discover we can organize ourselves into teams. And we can begin to do the work of making the hamburgers and the fries more effectively. And we'll take some time to learn and talk about what we're doing. And so in our team meetings, we'll continue to review how we've been doing. But the process continues. It's a cyclical process, and so it keeps going on, and each day is a new day. Underneath of this process is a leadership process, getting really clear on who we are, building relationships of trust and interdependence, sharing information abundantly so everybody knows what's going on all the time. And that process of leadership supports the process of actually doing the work in the McDonald's restaurant. Embedded within the Process Enneagram are 3 leadership processes. The self-organizing process shown in the center of identity, information, and relationship is one I've been talking about. Now and then we have a serious problem like the fire. We got to deal with the issues. We got to structure ourselves properly and do the work. That's operational leadership. Now and then we bring in a new quality program, like Six Sigma. So we have a new intention around quality. We have new principles and standards to learn, and we have new things that we got to do together. All 3 of these are important. Depending on the situation, the leader needs to know which of these leadership processes they need to be using at that moment. However, all 3 of these have problems if we're not careful. If the self-organizing process of identity, information, and relationship is not connected to real work, we just sit around and we sing Kumbaya and we feel good, but nothing happens. If we overdo the operational process, it becomes command and control, and that's where many organizations are stuck. And if we're not careful as we bring in new things, we can begin to develop cults that people know about this particular stuff, others don't, and they have insiders and outsiders, and you can create problems. So all 3 of these are important. All these 3 of these need to be used consciously, and we have to be careful that we don't get into the problems. Also embedded in the Process Enneagram is the transformational processes. For individuals, when we get clear on our intention and we develop the principles and standards of how we're going to work and we begin to address the issues, things begin to change inside of us. As we learn to work together in new ways and develop trust and understanding and listening, we begin to change inside. As we do all those things, we begin to come up with new ways to organize ourselves. We do the work, and then we take time to listen. And in this part of the process, the organization is beginning to transform itself. So on the right-hand side, we have individual transformation occurring. On the left-hand side, we have the organizational transformation occurring. And of course, it's cyclical. It keeps going around and around. As we use the Process Enneagram, we bring two important factors together. We have the business side of our organizations, where we're dealing with the hard stuff and the technology and the engineering and all that. The roots of the way in which we operate go way back to Frederick Taylor's book in 1911, Principles of Scientific Management. Taylor helped Henry Ford set up his production line. He did a lot of really good stuff, and he was an efficiency expert. And we had workers who were supposed to do what they were told, and we had managers who were supposed to think. And unfortunately, some of that stuff still hangs over us in organizations, and we're still struggling with what Taylor has brought in. There's also a lot of talk in organizations about needing to develop a better people focus and have justice and fair treatment, listening, respecting. When push comes to shove and organizations get in trouble, the organizational stuff surfaces higher and the people stuff gets lost. But in the Process Enneagram, the people work on the right-hand side blends in with the organizational work on the left-hand side, and we have the reconciliation of these two together, and we get partnering. It's the third force, which releases enormous creative energy, and we get safer, more productive organizations, less cost, easier. Everything improves if we can bring the two pieces together, which we can do in the Enneagram. We can do it almost seamlessly. So we come back. The Enneagram is a dissipative, creating the Enneagram is a dissipative process to create a dissipative tool. So when we go around the perimeter of the Process Enneagram, around the circle, we discover who and what they are. When we move to the inner pattern, we discover how and why stuff happens like it does. As we create the Process Enneagram, we create a bowl that provides order and focus. Now here's a picture of a generic Enneagram and the kind of questions you would ask. So when we're looking at identity, questions like what skills and gifts do you bring? What's your geographical spread? How centralized are you? What's going on? What's your story? We then ask people, what's your intention? What do you really want to have happen? What do you want to do? At point two, we begin to talk about what are the problems you're dealing with? What are the things that are blocking you? What are the hidden elephants? At point three, we ask these kind of questions about how we are together, trust and interdependence and whatnot. At four, we talk about the principles that we're going to live by: listening, helping, looking out for each other, telling the truth. At point five, we talk about the actual physical work that we'll be engaged in. What are the questions that are shown there? What are the key metrics? Are we building a bowl? Are we living by it? In information, we ask questions like what's available, what's new? In learning and potential, we begin to ask questions, are we really learning? What new opportunities are opening up? And then in context, we talk about the outside world and the competition and the structures, how you're organized inside. And with a group of people, like 15 or 20 people, in a half a day of this conversation, we can develop an Enneagram map that looks like this. And this is developed by a company that's trying to improve their safety. And so when we talked about identity, they talked about the kinds of things shown up at the top, up in this section. This is what they said they wanted to do. They wanted to get high performance. They wanted to have zero injuries and zero harm. These are the kind of problems they identified. They talked about their relationships, and sometimes they're not so good and they need to get stronger. And they agreed that these are the principles and standards, these are their words, that they need to live by in order to fulfill that. And we talked about the specific work they're going to do, aimed at fulfilling the intention. We asked them about the information, and they shared this with us. And they talked with us about how do they learn. And we talked about the outside competition and the internal structure. So this is a fairly complicated looking picture that means a lot to the people who created it. Not much to those who didn't create it. But for the people who created it, this becomes their map and their guidance. And as they move forward, they keep talking about what they're trying to do, holding each other accountable to live by the principles and standards, to deal with all these relationships. And as they come up with new ways to do the work, they begin to do the work and they begin to talk about this, and they learn and they see what's coming out of the work and what new potential is being created. This map creates the bowl, the dissipative structure that holds the organization. We have focused, disciplined conversations that provide the dynamical energy that drives the processes of sharing information, building relationships, and creating an identity. It provides the energy to do the work pieces, the steps of intention, issues, principles, and standards, work, learning, in context and structure. It's supported by the principles and standards of behavior, of quality, meaning, trust. These principles and standards are the keys which hold this together. And so we create a container where within the container, people have the freedom to learn and grow and to make the decisions about their work that are important and appropriate. And the bowl provides order and focus. So the upper management people need to pay attention to creating the bowl and helping people understand it so that people can live within the bowl and do excellent work. One of the things we also developed was a way to begin to measure the impact of our decisions around creating more sustainable or less sustainable organizations. We looked at 6 ratios. If a decision that we were making supported more emergent and fluid structures, that was good. If they were more rigid, it was not good. If there was more role flexibility, that was good. More role rigidity was not good. If we were valuing differences, that was good. If we were suppressing differences, not good. If there was a positive impact on the systems in which we're embedded, that's good. Negative impact was not. Are we self-reflecting? Are we self-remembering? Are we paying attention? Or are we sleepwalking? Is there more openness to and acting on future possibilities or not? So we looked at these 6 ratios for every decision. And we began to track the changes. So if the change that we were thinking about strengthened the numerator of one of these ratios, we gave it a +1. If it didn't have an impact on either of the numerator or denominator, we gave it a 0. If it strengthened the denominator, we gave it a -1. Then they added the scores for all 6 ratios to get a rating for the particular change. And then we plotted these versus time. To sustain the work, the changes need to strengthen the numerators and build positive scores. And so here's a chart from 1987 to 1993 at our plant in West Virginia. The magenta line in series 2 is our functioning effectiveness. That's the way in which we had the skills and the technology. The purple line was our organizational effectiveness. How were we working together? And the yellow line was the business effectiveness. And you can see the business effectiveness did not progress as fast as the others for a couple of years. And then it began to take off and began to increase quite rapidly. Our functioning effectiveness increased. Our organizational effectiveness actually got a hit because the company started to change benefits and take things away from people. And we realized very quickly we had to do some things to try to improve our organizational effectiveness, or we would lose the whole ball of wax. Now we can take this kind of a theoretical picture and we can look at actually what happened with respect to safety. This is a chart that shows safety performance from 1983 to out to 2006. When I came into the organization, our injury rate was at about 5.8. This is where I got the number 75 serious injuries. Using a very hard top-down process, we brought the rate down to about 0.47. This is the kind of stuff Cotter talks about in his book, Leading Change. We did all those things, maybe in a different order. We were a few years ahead of where he was. But that's the kind of stuff that got us down to here. But we couldn't sustain it. We were fighting. It was terrible. So we moved to teams. We began partnering, using the Process Enneagram, opening the flow of information, building trust and interdependence. And all during this period, I was walking the plant 5 hours a day, listening, watching, seeing, talking with people, sharing information, but not making decisions, because that would destroy the line organization. I had lots of questions when I would come back from my walks. That was another thing. But in this partnering period, our injury rate went down to about 0.3. And so instead of 75 injuries a year, we're talking about 1 or 2 or 3. One year, 1993, we had none. And during this period, we began to ask, what is happening to the rest of our dimensions of performance? Our earnings went up 300%. Productivity went up 45%. Emissions went down 87%. Everything we looked at got better. When I left the plant in 1995, they continued this terrific level of performance because people deep in the organization had value for it and were maintaining the systems and processes. Unfortunately, the plant managers more and more stayed in their offices. They slipped back to the old top-down management approach, to the point where in 2010, they killed a guy and had a big spills of chemicals, all within a 36-hour period. So this way of leading, using the Process Enneagram as a dissipative tool to have the disciplined conversations, and creating the Process Enneagram Map in the bowl, which helps us to hold ourselves out at the edge of chaos, far from equilibrium, we got terrific performance. So the process is change of the self-organizing criticality change process is one of disciplined, focused dialogue that builds the energy. We co-create the future with the Process Enneagram, which is the dissipative process. And we sustain the changes with the bowl, which is the Process Enneagram Map. And that's a dissipative structure. So in summary, the use of the self-organizing criticality combined with the Process Enneagram facilitates the creation of more dynamic, humane, resilient, productive, sustainable organizations. Having the conversations open for everybody to participate and contribute gives us much more variety and resilience. So I've tried to show why these things are useful and how they can be used. And in using those, anyone can become a more effective leader. They've got to step out, share information, do it in a way that builds respect and trust and interdependence, and help people see why it's important in their job for the success of the whole. So thank you very much.
Well, I should say thank you to you. Thank you for presenting all that. I've had one request for your slides as well as the recording. How do you feel about that?
That's fine. I'd be glad for people to do that. Just acknowledge what you're using, that's all.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you can send them to me and we'll discuss that later and I'll make them available.
Okay, that would be fine, yes.
So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A column, or if you can't find that, put it in the chat box. I'll monitor both. I don't see hands up very easily, so that's not a good method.
Well, everyone may have gone to sleep. I hope they did.
Okay, no, Candace is going to come on in a moment here. She has a question about metastability.
Hello, Candace.
Hi. I didn't know that was going to happen. I was just curious. I don't have the background in when you talk about metastable. What's meant by metastable?
It means it's not very stable. If you hold it still, suppose you have a pole and you stand the pole. You want to stand it up and you just sort of set the pole on its end. It's not very stable. You might get it to stand there for a bit, then it'll tip over. So it's not stable structure.
Okay. I'm glad I asked, because that's the opposite of what I would have thought of, actually. I thought meta might have meant very stable, but actually not, because it's
No,
In
everything.
constant stages of stability.
Yeah, everything is moving and changing all the time. So you might have a good stable day today, and then tomorrow everything is upside down.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And this way of leading then enables us to live and to work with these processes, even though they can get upside down.
Mm-hmm. Because we're always in that metastable place. That's
right. And with the Process Enneagram Map, we can see the parts and the whole and the interactions of the parts and how they influence each other. And a change in any one of those 9 points changes everything. And you can begin to see that very quickly.
right. So while I've got you, if you're looking at the diagram, there's also the gray lines that connect everything, and they create a sort of a star in the background. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Everything is connected to everything. The only lines that I've developed any understanding for are the ones that connect 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, and back to 1, the red lines, or the black line in the triangle. I don't, and it's taken a long time to understand the nature of the lines. So for example, when we're moving from our intention to our principles and standards, what we are doing on that line is connecting our values and beliefs towards how we want to behave and getting explicit. When we move from point 4 to point 2, what we then are doing on that line is beginning to apply our values and principles and standards towards the problems that we're dealing with and opening up the space where we can deal with those effectively. So the nature of the lines, the red lines are all important. The triangles are important. I expect that if a deep level, if I was around for another 100 years, I could get some insight on those, but I don't. One of the things about the tool is the Process Enneagram is that it's such a very rich tool, and we keep making discoveries. Right. And often it's not me making the discoveries. My wife Claire does a beautiful job in helping me say, well, wake up, dummy, look at this. And, you know, I see stuff from different eyes, and it's really important that we can do that together.
Nice. Thanks very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you go back to the screen where you had the Enneagram so that while we're talking about it, we have that on? And then I'm going to demote you, Candace, to become just an ordinary attendee. And we'll bring Robert Cutler on. I don't see him there. There he is. But we don't see him. You have to unmute yourself, or I'll unmute you. Okay, there we go.
Hello, Robert.
Hello. This is all very interesting. My question, which you may have partly answered in your last remark, is about structure amongst the 8 or 9, because 9 is the same as 1, elements.
9 is the same as 0, but we've gone
0. I mean, is 0? Yes.
Helix.
Right.
So 9 is above 0.
And you have just mentioned how the lines that you understand the best are going from 1 to 4 and 2 and 8 and 5 and 7.
And back to 1.
And back to 1, which, I just open a parenthesis, you probably know this, but it's sort of amusing to me that that's the reciprocal of 7, you know, is 0.142857 and so on ad infinitum. I'm sure that's a coincidence, but...
well, it may have been important for the people who created it. Nobody knows who they were.
Mm-hmm.
7 is a prime number. 3 is a prime number. So
mm-hmm.
1/3 is a repeating decimal as well.
And the first presentation suggests, when one is starting to listen to you, suggests that there's actually the fact that they're not enumerated from 0, 1, 2, 3 indicates or suggests that this is a kind of an order in that order, which idea is partly reinforced by your adoption of the language of monad, triad, dyad, triad, and so on, although there's not a one-to-one correspondence between those categories and the ones that are around your circle. And then you have the three triangles, the self-organizing, operational, and strategic triangles, which provide other orderings of these elements. And I'm wondering in the applied work, whether there, in terms of whether any of this suggests, or whether any of the applied work suggests, recurrence of sequences amongst different organizations, so that sequences of the healing of organizations, so that if there are, say, if you would be able to isolate 4 classes of sequences, then one might be able to say that there are 4 syndromes of organizational dysfunction in a qualitative sense. That's my question, whether you've made any motion toward this way of thinking.
That's an interesting question, and I haven't done it looking at it that way because I've been so focused at trying to help them get more healthy and to create this safe place for the people to work in and stop the bullying and violence. That would be an interesting one to pursue. The red lines are the sequence by which all activities take place. For example, suppose my identity is that I'm hungry and I want a cake. So my intention is to bake a cake. There are certain recipes I have to use, the principles and standards. You know, I need the different ingredients. I move back to 2, and I have to be sure I have all the right ingredients and all the pots and pans. When I move to 8, we set up the kitchen. At 5, we actually bake the cake. At 7, we taste it and see whether we like it or not and whether we need to mess with the recipe. So when we move back to 1 and make another cake, it's better. So that's the sequence by which all activities take place. If we skip those, you begin to get incoherence in the organization. And that's where you get double feeds into a particular points, and that causes confusions.
What is your reply to the question that naturally suggests itself in a very naive fashion, which is you've left out 3 and 6? That's not a criticism. It's a question about what is significant about the fact that this particular cycle, 1428571, in addition to leaving out 9 and 0, which are the same at different levels, that those are excluded, that it seems that those are one of your, that's the self-organizing triangle.
Correct. Those points, 0, 3, and 6, are quite different from 1, 2, 4, 5, and 7, and 8. And if you look at the process enneagram from a side view, which I haven't done here, but you see the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1 pattern will sit above the 0, 3, 6 pattern. And the leadership pattern supports the work that's being done. And no matter what the work is, that pattern, if it's consistent, will support them. And if you share information and whatnot.
When you say it sits above, you've already suggested that there's a kind of a helical structure such that 9 is above 1. Correct. And I do understand that that is a manner of depicting geometrically something that has a practical significance. What does it mean that something is above something else here?
Okay.
Or that, yeah.
That's excellent. The implication is that on each cycle we've learned and we've gotten better and we've become more understanding and know better.
So these are actually, this is not a single cycle. This is the fractal element aspect that you're referring to, that this process is embedded in itself, in itself, in itself.
That's right.
Got it.
It goes around and around. And it helps you to see there are different ways I've tried to depict this. One of them, to look at your question, is I drew an arrow from the lower left to the upper right and drew a spiral around that. And each spiral is a process enneagram as we move up the arrow toward higher levels of performance. So that, that's the way to depict it. It's a little bit different. Point 3, let's talk about relationship. Relationship has to do with levels of trust. Trust is not something that I can just walk in and turn a switch on and say, Robert, you trust me. That you might sock me in the nose. Trust is something that grows. We look at each other. We look like that person's willing to talk. Do we talk together? Do we make sense? When we make commitments, do we do it? Do we have the technical skills to do it? When we screw up, do we apologize and try to get better? So relationship of building trust is an emergent property, and that comes out of working with our principles and standards the best that we can to deal with the issues and ambiguities. As we do that, we create the space where trust and interdependence can grow. And when that's growing, then we have energy to apply to solving the problems rather than trying to protect our backs because we're fearful someone may stab us. Is that making sense?
Yes, yes, it does. And I'm just trying to conceptualize the 3, which is the relationship. You said that the triangle 0, 3, 6, 9 is on a different level. Correct. Than the others.
It supports the 1, 2, 4, 5.
It supports. Okay. Thank you.
Like it runs underneath. And if we're working on that leadership process and we're doing that effectively, it will support whatever the work is that we do. It flows through 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1.
And the higher up the helix, so to speak, you climb, the stronger becomes the base that supports it.
Correct. It's a growing experience for everybody. And we all had to learn. We had to learn at my plant in West Virginia because it was a different way for all of us to work together.
Well, you answered all my questions, and that's pretty good because this doesn't always happen. And I bet I'm going to quickly pass the parole, as we say, but the floor back to Pile before I come up with another question.
So I am taking you off just so somebody else can ask a question too. And we've got Larry Richards is up next. There he is. Promote to panelist. He should appear in a sec.
Hello, Larry. Hi, Larry.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Let me get my question up. Thank you for your presentation, by the way. Whoops, I just lost my question. Let me see if I can remember it.
Do you want me to read it out, Larry?
Yeah, go ahead if you would.
Virtually all economic organizations that employ labor, as we know them, are reward-oriented hierarchies. In reward-oriented hierarchies, self-promotion is encouraged, maybe even required for personal career advancement and self-preservation. How does self-promotion fit into your SOC organization?
Okay. That's one of the ambiguities that we live with all the time. And what we have to try to be doing together is to live in a way where we are working for the good of the whole. Lots of people don't do that. Lots of people are looking at this, what's in it for me, and that's all they care about. But what we find is that most people in organizations want to be able to contribute. They want to be winners. They want the place to get better. And if we can work as a leader, trying to be authentic and work for the good of the whole, then we can make good progress. If the organization is all caught up in what's in it for me and nothing else, this does not work very well. Stephen Covey told an interesting story of a business owner who took one of his employees one day out for a ride in the car, and they stopped and they looked at this beautiful farm with a nice fence, pretty pine trees behind the house and a nice pond. And the business owner turned to his employee and said, you know, if you work really hard for 10 years, that'll be all mine. That doesn't work very well in this kind of an approach. We've got to shift it. But where people want the organization to get better, and it really will get better, both from a business point of view and from the people side, it gets really better. My plant there in West Virginia could outperform practically any plant in the DuPont company. And people felt good about it. They were glad to be winners. But people we always have to ask the question, what's in it for me? So there's got to be equitable ways in which to compensate people and reward people for the work that they do. We just got to be careful not to pit people against one another if we can.
I guess that's the question. Since hierarchies narrow as they go up, only a few end up moving up and getting the rewards that go with it.
But they're higher up in the hierarchy. In many organizations, you tend to have some of us who are further along in our years, and we're beginning to look more and more at legacy and what are we leaving and creating. That helps people to become a bit more altruistic. But, you know, it's a tough dilemma, Larry. And I've been in some organizations where I got clobbered trying to do this stuff. And, you know, this will always work where people are willing to talk together about how we can all get better.
Thank you.
If people don't want to do that, then, you know, that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
We've got Sebastian Jones trying to pair. Whoops, I got the wrong person. I clicked the wrong link. Sorry, I will fix that. Oh, that's even worse. Richard Knowles becomes a panelist, and there we. I'm sorry. This is. There, finally. Unmute.
Hi. Good example of complicated system verging on complex, I think we just had here. So I was struck when you started off your presentation talking about your ideal was to try to maintain an organization teetering on the edge of chaos. Perhaps teetering is the wrong word, you didn't say that. But you talked about trying to keep an organization at the edge of chaos because that's the point at which it has the highest potentiality. That's really what I understood. Okay, you're nodding. Good. I'm glad I'm on the right track, at least that far. Okay, so my question really was when I try to think about how that sort of infinity loop of the panicky cycle works, it tells us that you simply can't maintain something on the edge of chaos. Things are going to cycle down. They're going to go through a crisis. The potentiality will be reduced, and then you will hopefully go through a rebuilding stage with another decision tree happening at the end of that before you can start that climb back up to the edge of chaos, which to me is where that process Enneagram really comes into play. But so I may or may not be on the right track there. But anyway, my real question is, isn't it rather tilting at windmills to try to stay at the edge of chaos?
Pele,
You're muted, Richard.
now you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, good. When we move out and go up that self-organizing criticality curve and move out far from equilibrium, one of the things I kept trying to do was not to push us too far too fast for fear of blowing the place up and having us all fall off the edge. The potential for failure is always there. And the more of us we have talking about what's going on, and the more of us we have trying to help, the more resilient we become, and the less likely we are to fall apart. Now, at some point, we may be creating enough changes that the organization actually reinvents itself, and we come up with new projects or new business propositions coming out of this as we seek new potential. And so we try to keep developing in that regard. If we move an organization up to the edge of chaos, like in a crisis, and they don't know how to stay there, they actually have to back out of that mode at some point, or they're likely to have the whole organization shatter on them and get destroyed and not be able to recover. So we're dealing with a situation where the outcomes are not always guaranteed. We got to do the best we can. But I think if we stay back in the mode of just managing, we can be pretty well guaranteed that the organization is going to die on us before long, because we aren't changing. We're not flexible enough. There's more. We have to manage our organizations. We got to take care of supply chains. We got to pay people properly and all that. But to grow and develop, we need to move up the self-organizing criticality curve. And we do that by talking together openly, trying to tell the truth as we see it, trying to avoid personal attacks, because that's not good. But build the relationship so that we can be open and honest with each other and learn together. That raises the probability of success a whole lot, but it doesn't guarantee it, because we can still, the world is one of hazard, and things can come in and, you know, and change things. So it's maybe the term that would be better than the edge of chaos would be far from equilibrium, which is a term that Prigogine used by systems, dissipative systems that move to be far from equilibrium. In the management mode, we're closer to equilibrium, reliability, stability, control. When we move up the self-organizing criticality curve, we're moving away from equilibrium. And so part of it is how fast and how far do you want to go? And in self-organizing criticality, one of the points I made was that most of the changes are small. That's good. If an organization has a change right off the bat that's a very big one, it probably won't be successful because no one knows how to live in it. With the number of small changes, we can begin to learn together. We can make mistakes. The place doesn't go down the drain. And we can help each other and we can learn. So I think small changes are good. So for example, at the plant in West Virginia, I knew we were making progress when I was walking around one day, and one of the mechanics said, who had been in charge of a small group of contractors, said, I kicked them off the plant today because they weren't following the safety procedures. And he did that on his own. Well, that's a pretty significant small change, and that was good. Another one told me he shut down one of our units because he'd seen a small wetness at the base of a relief valve on top of a distillation column. And rather than waiting for it to fail, he shut it down to fix it. So those were the small changes that were good. We got to be learning to the point where we made some really big changes, and one of them was around converting our process control operations from pneumatic to electronic control systems. And you know, most of the time when people come in to change control systems, they have processes to design the new one, build a parallel system and run it for a while, and then take the old one out. We converted 16 of our processes. We never ran parallel and we never failed. Now, if we tried to do that early on, it'd have been a disaster. But as we learned to work together and help each other, we began to be able to do quite extraordinary things together. So it's a slow learning process.
I'm going to interrupt, so there's time for one more person to ask a question before you run out.
Was that all right, Sebastian? Did that help?
Yes, it did. Obviously, you can spend weeks on this stuff, but that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Yes.
I'll also point out that the questions have been very helpful in my understanding of this whole stuff too. So thanks to everybody.
Well, I've been at it for 25 years, so it takes a while.
Okay, Mark is coming on next with a question. He didn't specify.
Hello, Mark.
Hello, Richard. Thank you so very much for the presentation today. It was awesome, and I've been fortunate to be in restructurings and seeing this. And your Enneagram is a wonderful model, and be honored to be able to try and use that sometimes in the future. And I thank you for that. So my question is,
Give me a
as
call
you
if you
mentioned,
want.
you've had. Well, thank you. I will get your information from Pilla in the future. You know, as you mentioned, you've tried this a few times and you've had where it's failed in us, or you've had backlash or people not wanting to. And I guess my question would be it's a complex model, but seems extremely effective. What challenges or how do you go about introducing this to an organization? I would say that would be that's so important to get the leadership to buy in for the big picture, and because it's a bit of a longitudinal process to create this into an organization, to see the change and the effectiveness possibly. So you really have to create that buy-in at the front end to be effective, I think, or to be successful. And I was curious, how do you approach your organizations that way?
That's an excellent question, and you're right. If we begin to use this in an organization, it changes them fundamentally enough that the top people have to be on board to make it work. Because it's very hard if they aren't, and they'll destroy it because it can be quite fragile at the beginning. All you have to do is to take one person who stepped out to be different and hang them, and the whole organization gets the message, and that's the end of it.
Egos get in the way, right?
There's a whole lot of ego problems. And one of the biggest problems we have once we begin to do this with organizations is helping the people to learn how to talk together. We do more work on walking out on the floor and helping people talk with their people, not talk at them, but talk with them, to listen, to learn together. That's a big step. Lots of managers are unwilling to do that, I think partly because they're not clear in their own mind what they should be doing. We have this silly idea that the higher the people are in the organization, the smarter they are and the more they know. And so if I'm a manager and go out and someone asks me a question and I can't answer it, that makes me look like a chump. Well, that's a foolish place to be, but I had to learn to break that pattern in myself. So there's a need to go out and interact. And there's also a need for the organizations, particularly bigger ones, to learn how to use this. And so at the top level in a bigger organization, they need to spend more time on the right-hand side of the Enneagram and create the bowl and nurture the bowl and help their reports to understand how to use the bowl so that their reports further down in the organization can work within it and make good decisions about the work that needs to be done. One of the problems I had as a manager was that I did not know what was happening in detail from one day to the next, because people were being innovative and creative. And sometimes I had to really suck it up and say, oh man, this is pretty good, but holy cow, I hope we're right. Because in that big plant, if we screwed it up, we could cause, you lose a tank car of HCN, hydrogen cyanide. You don't want to do that. You don't want to have a big release or a small one. So we had to learn to live with the ambiguity. But as long as people were working within the bowl, and we worked really hard, that's what I was doing as I was walking the plant, was really creating that with people, then we'd be okay. And I never really found a situation where people had left them and deliberately walked out of the bowl and moved to someplace else in their work. And so people began to do quite extraordinary stuff together. And I learned about it a few days later, maybe. But we kept getting better and better. But the top people, you're right, have to be able to say, you know, they're going to be in this and they're going to support it and make it happen. And so what you need to have really to begin with is helping them to work on a really tough question that they're struggling with and haven't been able to overcome. And the level of frustration is high enough that they really want to solve this problem. That begins to open the door so you can go in. So for example, if an organization is at a fatality, that's a time when they're fairly open and receptive to talking about things that need to be done. Hopefully we don't have to have many fatalities, but nevertheless, if an organization has got problems with customer service, it's just driving them wild and they can't get to where they need to. This is a way to open up that conversation and to get there. And that tends to make the top people more receptive, because if they see they can solve the problem, then that'll improve the business performance and the organizational stuff. Is that making sense?
Oh, very much so. No, that really helpful. And I guess the interactions at that front end are so important, of creating that open communication and acceptance of change, and understanding that people at the top will often feel so strong about their belief that they're not willing to, but getting that proverbial 2x4 to get their attention sometimes is probably the trick.
Well, one of the questions
to being successful at opening the doors.
Early on in this work, I got to know Margaret Wheatley pretty well. She had written a book, Leadership in the New Science. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions she would ask would be, what does the system want to have happen? Now, early on, I'm the plant manager, and my reaction to that was, what do you mean? I'm the manager. And it was that ego problem that we're talking about. Since then, I've come to learn that as the manager, I can help really influence the system. As the manager, you know, what is the business about? Where are we trying to go? That kind of stuff. Do strategic stuff. But then my job is to go out and help people in the organization understand why that's important and why we all need to be together trying to do that. But there has to be something down. It's really important for me as a manager. We got to change this, because what we got isn't working.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Good note to end it with. Thank you, Mark, for all your questions, and to everybody. So, Mark, thank you to you, Richard, for this wonderful presentation. I will be posting it to the ASC membership list in about 2 weeks as we advertise the next presentation. And I will send it to those people who have been part of my discussion groups fairly immediately. But if anyone else would like to have the video recording, just let me know. Send me an email. And you will send your slides to us, Richard? To me?
Yes, I'll send you the slide package later.
And are you open to having people send you emails if they have further questions?
Absolutely. And call me as well. My phone number is 716-622-6467. I'm in Eastern time zone, so don't call me in the middle of the darn night, please.
Okay. So thank you again very much. And thanks for taking the time and doing such a lovely presentation for us.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.